Students and teachers of Latin are gradually beginning to take note of recent trends in language pedagogy and theories of language acquisition. The main realizations are: 1. The volume of reading is more important in language acquisition than quality. For language development, it is better to read 100 pages of simple, engaging Latin than 10 pages of Cicero or Virgil. You have a much better chance at staying afloat when you turn to a classic author if you have a few hundred pages of reading under your belt. 2. Grammar translation methods create good translators and good philologists, but only very rarely create good lifelong readers of Latin. No one except a professional academic is going to set aside an hour or more to translate a page of Latin. We are doing a disservice to our students if this is all they can manage after 4 years of instruction. And finally, 3. Cultivating speaking and listening facilitate language acquisition and ultimately produce better readers of Latin literature, which is always the goal. I'm not going to delve deeply into any of these topics, so if you're not in agreement with the 3 points I just made, I will leave links to articles and videos about extensive reading and about modern language pedagogy as applied to classics at the end of the description. Rather, in this video, I will be outlining and reviewing the best tools available for learning how to read Latin with ease and fluency. By far the best method currently available for learning Latin is Lingua Latina per se Illustrata. The first volume, Familia Romana, here on the left, is essentially a graded Latin reader. The entire book is written in Latin, and all new words are glossed with synonyms, antonyms, images, or Latin paraphrases. The first chapter begins with sentences which almost any speaker of an Indo-European language would understand, such as Roma in Italia est. By the end of the 35 chapters, you have been exposed to all of Latin syntax and grammar, and about 2,000 words. The number of words a textbook teaches is one of the most important things to consider. Rarely do most other textbooks teach more than 500 or 1,000 words, yet you need around 4,000 to begin reading Latin literature comfortably. Another important feature of this book is that the entire narrative is continuous, focusing on a Roman family in the early empire. The story is relatively interesting and engaging. It is not high literature, but it can still be read on its own merits. By the end of the book, students will have read about 300 pages of Latin, which is more than many Latin majors will read in 4 years of study at the best universities in the world. Remember, quantity over quality. Even if you are already an advanced student of Latin, I still recommend this book. I had studied Latin for 5 years before I got this book, but I wasn't able to read Latin fluently. I read this book and other books in the series as a PhD student preparing for my qualifying exams, and it was only then that I really began to read Latin swiftly and easily. I should also mention that the entire book has been recorded and is available on Amazon and iTunes for download. Access to good audio material is essential for all language learners, but especially those who are self-studying and do not have an opportunity to speak or hear Latin in the classroom. On the right, you will see the second volume in the series, Roma Aeterna. This is essentially an advanced Latin reader. All of the selections are taken from Roman authors and are organized in such a way so as to narrate the story of Roman history from the earliest beginnings down to Augustus. The first 70 or 80 pages are adapted, and after that the texts are more or less left unadapted. The book continues to gloss all new words only in Latin. I found this to be extremely helpful for beginning to think in Latin. To read Latin fluently, it is very important to acquire a copia verborum, and one of the best ways to do this is to start thinking not in terms of English definitions, but Latin synonyms and explanations. That way, when you are reading Cicero, you can ask yourself, why did he say it this way, and why did he use this word and not that word? These are important questions to consider, but unfortunately most classicists cannot begin to answer them fruitfully. The second volume introduces about 1,500 more words. There are also readers available in this series for specific authors, presented in the same style, with Latin notes and explanations. When I was preparing for my PhD exams, I first read Familia Romana a few times, then Roma Aeterna, and then I read every reader available in the series. When I finally began working through the reading list for my exams, I was reading Latin more or less like I read any other modern language. The Lingua Latina per se Illustrata books are so good that I almost do not want to talk about any other beginner's text, but the Assimil Latin course deserves an honorable mention. This book is available in French, Italian, and German. Be sure to get the one written by Clément de César, as there is another one floating around that is nowhere near as good. The newest editions come with recordings in both ecclesiastical and restored classical pronunciation. There are 100 fun lessons which take you through simple dialogues all the way through excerpts from Latin literature. It contains over 2,000 vocabulary words. If you internalize these dialogues through repeated listening, you have a very strong foundation as a reader of Latin, and should you ever wish to speak Latin, you will find it easy to transfer your passive knowledge to active knowledge. If you don't know French, Italian, or German, you can still use the course and the audio after you have completed another Latin course to further expand your vocabulary and command of the language. As I said, access to good audio materials is essential, and this course delivers. After you have gone through some of the above methods, the next step will be to begin reading Simple Latin. These are just some of the many options available. On the left, we have Beeson's Primer of Medieval Latin. Medieval Latin is generally easier to read than classical literature. This book will give you about 300 pages of authentic Latin to work with. After doing Lingua Latina per se Illustrata, you should be able to read this book swiftly and without a dictionary. Also available is Harrington's Medieval Latin. The selections are slightly more difficult, but should pose no problem. The Historia de Duobus Amantibus, pictured in the center, was written in 1444 by Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, or Pope Pius II. It is an erotic novel which was an international bestseller at the time. The style is crisp, clean, elegant, and rather easy. Finally, the Gesta Romanorum is a collection of medieval tales, which also provides hundreds of pages of easy Latin reading. Both this and the Historia de Duobus Amantibus are available free on the internet, but I'll put links to paper versions in the description. After you have done lots of extensive reading in Latin, the next step is to start using bilingual texts. Bilingual texts are one of the most powerful tools available for learning any language. They knew this in antiquity, in the Renaissance, and scholars of language acquisition know it now. The negative attitude towards the Loeb library and to bilingual text among classicists is a recent development, which likely stems from the fact that many teachers and professors of Latin and Greek do not know the languages well, and in class do little more than check their students' translations. In such a case, the Loeb library would render the teacher redundant by democratizing the learning of Latin and Greek and taking away the secret knowledge of the teacher. I, at any rate, was always taught that Loebs are cheating. The best way to use bilingual text is the following. First, use the translation to help you understand the entire text. At the beginning stages, this might mean comparing every sentence. Second, reread only the Latin text using the translation when you forget a word or construction. This makes the translation into an instant dictionary. Third, continue to reread the text until you can make it through the entire thing without looking at the translation. Repeated rereadings are key in developing a deep and lasting fluency in Latin. I should also mention that in addition to the Loeb library, there is the Itati Renaissance library. Often the difficulty of reading Latin comes not from vocabulary or syntax, but from the distance which separates our worldview from the Romans. Our worldview is much closer to the Renaissance, and so Renaissance texts are often much easier than classical ones. Backwards chronological reading is an excellent strategy, not only for Latin, but for other languages as well. For example, it is much easier to start with modern Greek and work backwards than with ancient Greek and work forwards. Definitely know about the Usum Delphini series. All of these books are available for free online and cover the majority of classical authors. For poets and harder prose authors, you get a paraphrase and simpler Latin next to the text, along with notes and an introduction in Latin. Think of them as a more advanced version of the Lingua Latina per se Illustrata series. These texts are great for developing your ability to think in Latin and to read and talk about texts in Latin, and they're also a great resource for teachers of advanced Latin courses who are trying to plan lessons conducted in Latin. I'll leave a link to the page where all of these titles can be found in the description. How well you know Latin, like how well you know any other language, has nothing to do with talent or intelligence. It is a simple product of how many hours you have spent with the language. You can quantify it even more specifically by how many sentences of Latin your brain has received and understood, either through the eyes or through the ears. Research shows that comfortable reading of simple text begins at around 10,000 sentences, which just happens to be the number of sentences in Familia Romana. And comfortable reading of literature will begin around 100,000 or 200,000 sentences. Absolute mastery happens around 1 million sentences, and a native speaker will have processed many times more that number. Always keep these numbers in mind when you are studying or teaching Latin. How many sentences of Latin did you read, speak, or hear today? Similarly, speaking Latin or any other language is not a product of talent or intelligence, but only of practice. To speak a language well, you have to speak a lot. Good speakers are distinguished from bad speakers only mathematically. Good speakers have simply spoken a greater quantity of sentences. If you want to speak Latin, you must first have a good passive understanding of the language. If you can read Latin fluently, you are only a short jump away from being able to speak well. You only have to find people with whom you can practice. Try searching the internet for spoken Latin conferences and courses, for spoken Latin clubs and circles, or for online Latin conversation partners. Finally, please check the description for links to the books discussed here.